On One World, they began each nightly newscast by announcing that anyone who still saw any difference between fiction and nonfiction and between information and entertainment was already too visually impaired to be watching what was to follow. But now on with our newscast. One man swallowed his best friend, but for a long time could not seem to digest him. One way by which thinking creatures help compensate for not knowing as certain who they are as do merely instinctive ones is by them giving themselves individual names. Carl, this is Bob. Bob, this is Carl. And Bob and Carl, that's a lion over there, but never mind him. He's not one of us. The simpler the person, the safer they feel in a crowd. Same with individual ideas and the thinking of the collective. One man discovered a time bomb planted in his head, but decided it was probably okay, since it wasn't set to go off until the day he died anyway. Even in man's intellectual world, leadership is still based on things instinctive. Does this not answer certain questions regarding activities therein? One man took pills for some of his ills, but with others, he just let them slide. When it came to habits, one man said, I can quit any time I want. When it came to addictions, one man said, I can stop any time I choose. When it came to quitting making claims of how he could change, one man couldn't. News of the hunt. The difference between stomachs and brains is that stomachs can stalk silently in the night while brains beat about the bush making too much noise. One man found that the only way to apparently combat the opposition to his life's great desire was by staying continually aware of their existence. But due to their numbers and the limitations of normal awareness, he found the best he could do was to try and be aware of this particular one for a while, and then another one, and so on. But after many years of this approach, he reached a climatic decision of saying, to hell with it, and from then on just tried to ignore them all. It seems that when the simple bond together in collective conclusions, they become more intelligent than they would be individually. The humor in this one is in the use of the term, it seems that. It is difficult to ride a train without something to do along the way before you reach your destination. It is tricky to try and run a mystical system without giving the participants the illusion of something to do before they reach their own understanding of exactly what the journey is. Men cherish the notion of busy work, since that's all most ever experience. Bob, this is Carl. One man threw out all of his history books, burned all his accounts receivable, ceased to engage in any form of gossip, but all, alas, to no avail, since he still had his reliable, his mental memory. Later, his instincts suggested to his intellect that it could benefit from pondering the fact that it recalls nothing. That's not of benefit. Potential helpful hint, though for some may be a bit too late. If you never get to thinking too much, you diminish the likelihood of ever getting entangled in this mysticism stuff. The reason men love the adage, better late than never, is due to its high exemplary standing in the halls of the vacuous and impertinent. One man kept many things private. Not that he had to, he just did. There was once born a bird who, by the time he was grown, was singing, as was natural. Then for some reason he decided to try and stop, and after years of effort could sometimes cease to sing. But what he could never do was to stop thinking about it. Regarding the apparent solidarity of mental reality, A thing partially flawed seems totally flawed, or else a thing partially flawed is not necessarily totally flawed. Hey, you can't ask for a better deal than that. An unusual aspect of having a mini-stroke, noted one man, is that while you're in the midst of it, you're never aware of it. Huh, mused a listener. Not unlike thinking. The reason men enjoy the lives of dead mystics more than they do the lives of living ones is because the lives of the dead ones seem to move in an orderly, consistent fashion. Now that I've started it, many people like the picture of a train ride as a metaphor for the mystical quest, in that it seems to imply a journey firmly laid out on a set of established tracks going to a known destination. Regarding the apparent insolubility of man's reality, a message delivered by a flawed messenger is itself perforce flawed, or else the validity of a message delivered by a flawed messenger is in no way affected. Hey, it just gets better and better. With one man, everything he ate went straight to his head. The plagiarism by which ordinary artists attempt to conceal their lack of creativity, they often try and pass off as homage to the past. But, my friends, when it comes to thinking, everybody's into roots music. Repetitiveness is to the collective as a breath of fresh air is the individual. Many people are born identical twins, but know it not. For those searching for it, the little humor in the above is in the inclusion of the adjective many to modify people. Ha ha. Is that a good one or what? Ha ha. Men like to say sometimes that it's a cold, harsh world out there. This being the intellectual world commenting on the instinctive one, a realm regarding which its observations are, to say the least, self-serving. Another fact that everybody knows but few care to face. The shoddier the merchandise, the more it needs promoting. Do you still ever give any thought to the singular ferocity with which men defend their mentality? The ordinary are motivated by being collectively told what to do and made to believe it was individually their choice. While we're at it, let us define plainly the simple. The simple are the ordinary. One man thought he wanted to become an actor until he finally became cognizant of the inadvertent experience he'd already had in that area. Knights wear steel helmets so as to keep any mini-strokes to themselves. Many who get on the train weary eventually of riding the train, but make the mistake of thinking on their way out is to physically get off the train. One man enjoyed a certain specialty food dish so much that he purchased a machine specifically made for its production. But after being able to make it at home, he soon grew weary of it. Sound familiar to anyone in an area outside the kitchen? When one man saw a book promising to reveal 101 ways to excite your lover, he coyly caressed his mind and said, "Well, how's about it, baby?" The memory of mystics is not the same as everyone else's, which is one reason their history is so vague and unreliable. Some of the simpler folks who live downstairs say that they actually prefer it down there compared to those living higher up in the building. For one thing, say they, it's warmer down here. The collective has a magnetic appeal to the ordinary that is near irresistible. Academic definition update, psychology, sociology for people afraid of crowds. Every morning for most of his life, as soon as he had awakened, one man would say, "Okay, up and at 'em." Then finally one fine morning stopped and asked himself, "To whom am I talking, my body or my mind? And whichever it be, why feel I the apparent need?" Spooky, huh? For many years did one man feel himself to be all right. But then, after certain kinds of reflection and attempted self-scrutiny, he began to believe himself ill in some sort of way. Then, after many additional years of thinking himself not all right, he finally stumbled upon the liberating medical concept of fuck health. Of what value is transcendency if it does not take you beyond where you are? In an attempt to encourage an improvement in his sight, one man began rubbing poison on the earpieces of his glasses, which he so often held in his mouth while absorbed in deep thought. Within a closed system, who can validly speak of self-reliance other than the system itself? As they were scurrying from the garden, Adam said to Eve, "Just as soon as we're out of here, I'm inventing religion or something like that." There was once a man who swallowed a small chipmunk, only to be himself swallowed by a large squirrel. And as he was going down, said to himself, "Where the hell did they ever find a squirrel this size?" Whenever he'd catch himself not being driven by thought and would be near a mirror, this one man would look at himself and say, "I love it when you do that." The factual distinction between real knights and mythical ones is that the mythical variety are always referred to as having existed in organized groups. Today's quiz regarding the perspective of chronology. Is man's instinct years behind his intellect, or the other way around? Well, yeah, but how could it be the other way around? Come on, give us a break. One man shot his closest friend, but he was such a stay-at-home that he never got far enough away from the body to realize what he had done. Still another cause for men delighting in the picture of travel as a metaphor for the mystical struggle, in that it allows them to imagine what fun it would be if they ever did leave home and get away from themselves. There was once a man who believed that imprisoned within him was a beautiful mystical bird which, through certain efforts, could eventually be set free. But after many years of trying to achieve this goal, the man began to think of the creature as a parasitic vulture. A roach one morning awoke to find itself changed into a gigantic author. If words conceal as much as they reveal, then mystical metaphor is doubly guilty. Hence the knight's evolution from being bareheaded to helmeted to eventually bareheaded once again. If consciousness comes from instinct, then where the hell is thinking's home? Autoeroticism at its transcendental finest. One man just finally ate himself and was done with it. One man had implanted in his head a radio receiver over which he had no control. He didn't actually have it done, but says that saying he did makes the situation as it is seem a bit less embarrassing. One man finally wrote in and asked just who this one man is. If consciousness was the reality of the secret, then thinking is merely thinking about it. One man agreed to sit for an interview, but only if he could ask the questions. But upon learning that he had agreed to such conditions, he canceled, saying that it would be an utter misuse of energy. Waste of his time. There was once a prison wherein the inmates were kept captive merely by the conversation of the guards. Even baboons and hyenas have heroes. Shouldn't man do better? After they've aged sufficiently, men become covered in a patina, which they take to be themselves. Ask not for whom the statue in the park stands, it stands for thee. And to help augment your herb-gathering pleasure, yet another distinction. Enriched consciousness is immediate, mere thinking, not. When they first undertake their charge, knights are given a code of conduct to follow. But once a traveler comprehends the instinctive rules of the road, nobody has to tell him how to behave. But notice how even the most sophisticated of ordinary men continue to endorse a life lived according to some decorous external standard. 'Tis indeed a solid relief to feel as though your confinement is self-made and undeniably in your own best interest. Instinct is driven by instinct, and the mind by thought. But the difference is that instinct can only be driven by instinct. Men have long looked upon the idea of secret transcendental knowledge as being the key to solving the mysteries and questions of the mind. Yet take not under consideration the fact that their body, which, no matter their degree of mental orientation, still makes up a substantial part of what they are, has no mysteries or questions. But by the by, you might care to note that in spite of the above, many wannabe mystics want to believe that man instinctively misuses the body in certain ways that must be corrected before any metaphysical progress is possible. Only the simple believe that they become what they eat, in blatant contradiction to the glaring evidence before and within them. Yet another reason that true mythical knights always take their lunch with them. A non-standard, mentally curious man looking for satisfying info in the common marketplace is like a prisoner expecting escape plans from the warden. Men find favor with the picture of some sort of captivity as a metaphor for the human condition, inasmuch as it is severely flawed and helps keep them from seeing the actual situation. Symbolism serves not simply the needs of man, not hardly, old dears. Man is only bulletproof mentally, not physically. One man finally threw his oldest friend out. With transcendent hospitality, the last sting is the sharpest. Success to a real warrior is at best merely an accidental byproduct. There was once a bird who, by the time he was grown, was singing, as was natural. Then for some reason he decided to try and stop, and after years of effort could sometimes cease to sing. But what he could never do was to stop thinking about it. Men love to sometimes say that it's a cold, harsh world out there, and this being the intellectual world commenting on the instinctive one, a realm regarding which its observations are, to say the least, self-serving. The ordinary are motivated by being collectively told what to do and made to believe that was individually their choice. Is man's instinct years behind his intellect, or the other way around? There was once a man who believed that imprisoned within him was a beautiful mystical bird which, through certain efforts, could eventually be liberated. But after many years of trying to achieve this goal, the man began to think of the creature as a parasitic vulture. One man had implanted in his head a radio receiver over which he had no control. He didn't actually have it done, but says that saying he did made the situation as it is seem a bit less embarrassing. There was once a prison wherein the inmates were kept captive merely by the conversation of the guards. In your humble opinion, all of these seem somehow related, if not about the same thing put in different ways, or conversely, different things put in the same way. But we don't have anyone here qualified to go further into that distinction, so we will let it go down the chute. But consider, I bet we could all guess that could listen to those and recall them simultaneously for a few minutes, that they have to do with the internal nature of man. There was once a bird, once born a bird who, by the time he was grown, was singing as was natural. Could I suggest, where it says bird, that you could think of man? Because you surely don't think this is, well, some of you might, but you've turned in the wrong channel if you think this is parakeets today. This is, I think that's on channel 13 or 14 this time of night. But there was once a bird born who, by the time he was grown, was singing as was natural. Would you look upon the fact that by the time a man is grown, he is singing a mortal song, and I pointed out, perhaps redundantly, as was natural, as is natural. Also assuming that you would take singing to be a symbol or a metaphor at least for something besides singing, because some quite reasonably intelligent and fairly good-looking people can't sing worth a damn. So singing very likely is a stand-in for some other attribute, some other activity. But here we have the bird born who, by the time he was grown, was singing as was natural. So here you are. You reached the age of being grown, and you were singing as was natural to your ornithological species or type. But then this bird, for some reason, decided to try and stop. But stop something as natural as singing would be to a bird. And after many years of effort, could sometimes cease to sing. But the one thing he could not do, he could never achieve, was being able to stop thinking about it. What if you took that metaphor, or what if you take the picture before doing anything else and just take it as it is? What is more natural to a bird than singing? Nothing. It would seem from even outside views, from a human view, that if you overlook its place in the ecological food chain, you would think that that is the outstanding characteristic of birds. That most people would not even conceive of birds to them personally serving a particular use in life were it not for their ability to sing so sweetly. So if you take away the singing from a bird, again, we're just saying from a very crude and flyby human view of it, if you take away the ability to sing from a bird, what have you got? He might still be attractive, but you have deleted, at least if you have a musical ear or a good ear, you've deleted at least half of its appeal from an outsider's view. That even if it no longer sang and you looked at it and you said, well, it is attractive, it's real cute, but you would be missing at least half of what it had done previously, that is, of also sing. Why in the world would a bird want to cease singing? But according to this story, this particular bird, after many years of effort, for whatever reason, reached the point that he sometimes could refrain from singing. But the thing he could never do was to stop thinking about it. Men like to say that sometimes it's a cold, harsh world out there. this sentence may have gotten a bit convoluted. Men like to sometimes say that it's a cold, harsh world out there. But when they say that, this is what's happening. It is their intellectual world. Take it as an individual man who said that. Somebody says, it's a cold, harsh world. Cold, cruel, harsh out there. From that man, it is his intellectual world commenting upon his instinctive one. As always, humans operating with no greater ability to seize an understanding of reality than through personal anecdotes, then take the personal anecdote and try to, not knowingly, but try and present it in the context of some greater observation. I think psychology likes to call it projecting, but they try and turn what is nothing but an offshoot of personal anecdote, what is occurring in them that they have no way to analyze in any useful manner, and if they're appearing to make some more magnanimous, even pseudo-scientific, objective observation, they will take this misunderstood or ununderstood, non-comprehended activity within themselves, and then they make a comment about life out there. Well, you can imagine your own circumstances. How often, it's not that uncommon, but just try and consider the circumstances under which an ordinary man, in the course of conversation, someone says something, someone's making a personal anecdote about themselves, or the speaker just got through making one, and people go, my, that's really horrible, or you didn't deserve that. And then the speaker says, well, I know, but then he begins this momentary attempt to wax philosophically and says, well, hey, it's a cold, harsh world out there. Now, forget the personal anecdote, the experience that seemed to give rise to this in a conversation with an ordinary man. Anytime people say that, whatever the apparent circumstances that motivated them to make such an observation, beyond all of that, what I'm pointing out to you is the basis of it. Is that when a man under whatever circumstance says, well, it's a cold, harsh, cruel world out there, just unfeeling. You do get I didn't go into the circumstance, but if something really unjust happened to a man, that he describes how he was trying to help somebody, and he gives the personal anecdote turned severely ironic, that he was trying to help a man. He saw a guy's car over at the side of the road and tried to stop and help him and push him out of the mud. By the time he did, the guy pulled a gun on him and robbed him, and then jumped in his car and took off. Or you just tried to, you speak of the injustice of life, but it's always, with an ordinary man, it's going to arise from some personal anecdote. But then after the person makes the observation, it is a cold, harsh world out there, and almost anyone who's engaged in an agreeable conversation with the speaker, they'll go, yeah, because everyone's had that happen. But what is not taken into account is the basis of it, and the basis of it is not the childish level exemplified by a personal anecdote, because a personal anecdote doesn't prove anything except to a mystic, and it's only a mystic, as some of the past writers have tried to point out, that can see the universe in a drop of water, and etc. But for ordinary people, taking a personal anecdote as being evidence of something, it's neither here nor there. But the reason I keep bringing up personal anecdotes, if you understand in a wider sense than it's normally used, is that is the best handle the ordinary mind can get on what's happening in life. It is picking out one piece of a puzzle at a time. It's picking one tick off of this infinitely sized dog. It's simply taking one example, and it seems to fit the situation. The example is always going to come, well, it can come theoretically from something they read, and they just throw into the hopper of the conversation, but when it seems to have any soul and feeling to it, they will normally even preface it. They'll go, well, that reminds me. In fact, what you're talking about a hard, cruel world, hey, let me tell you what happened to me just yesterday. And that's the best grip they can get on any analyzation of reality, is to take whatever the conversation is pointing towards, such as it's a unjust, cold, hard world out there. And the man goes, well, yeah. And apparently he's going to contribute his own insightful observation, but all it is, the best he can do if he's going to offer anything other than just parrot something he picked up out of the newspaper or off a cereal box, or a fortune cookie, which everyone can hear that, and I'm discounting it. That is much of human conversation. That is cliches, and that is just simply blatant mechanical speech. But if the person apparently is trying to add anything of any potential significance to the conversation, it will always be on the basis, because that's all they have to go by, the ordinary mind, is some personal anecdote, a personal experience. Them go, I agree. It is a cold, harsh world out there. In fact, hey, I got further proof of it. And they take it as being absolute proof, or they take it as being some form of proof, and it's no proof of anything. So I'm not talking about just the psychological, or any possible psychological, sociological, social significance to men everywhere saying it's a cold, harsh world out there. There is no meaningful explanation at the surface level. I'm not explaining why people do it. I'm explaining the basis of what it is, that people never can see past their own experience. They can never even see past hearing about other people's experience to see what the basis of it is. And the basis of it is, with any cliche, I might also point out, any cliche, proverb, adage, maxim, there is always some validity. In the same way there's some validity to history. If people keep saying so-and-so happened, there's some validity. It doesn't matter whether it happened or not. That's not the point. But there is something there. And this is a very common, thousands of years old cliche that, hey, it's a cold, harsh world out there. The basis of it is electrochemical. The basis of it is absolutely physiological as compared to psychological. And the basis is, when a man says that, when a man agrees that, well, yes, that's true, then within the man saying it or agreeing to it, it is his intellectual world making a non-comprehended comment on his and the entire instinctive world. And need I point out, a valid comment. Because compared to the way the mind looks at life, the way that any person's mind looks at life, the instinctive aspect of life is the living example of harshness, cruelness, coldness, impartiality. So it's not a matter that people, now this the way that ordinary minds see it is that they are commenting on the nature of man. That's why I was trying to make a comparative distinction and say that what I was about to say was not a psychological analyzation. That is what they are in fact doing, because when ordinary people say it's a cold, harsh world out there, they're not saying the temperature is down. They're not saying it snows too much around here. It may. They could be making a comment in the northern sector of Alaska, but that's not what they're saying. They're saying that they're saying that other humans are cold, harsh, unfeeling, uncaring. That's what it always means. That's not the basis. That is not where it really comes from. That again is ordinary mind seeing anything to which it finds some agreement, seeing it on the basis of personal anecdotes. That if someone agrees, when they hear the comment that yes, it is a cold, harsh world out there, and they agree passionately, then what they're agreeing to is some memory they have of the last time or one of the big times that they were treated by another human in a cold, harsh manner. Because they're not saying, they say it's a cold, harsh world out there, a cold, harsh life out there. No matter what term they can say, world or life, and other people go, yeah. And they're not talking about world, not in some expansive sense. They're not talking about life. What they're saying is other humans can certainly be cruel, harsh, and cold. That's what everyone's saying. But that says nothing. You're relaying a personal anecdote. It can be couched and even have the aura of it being a philosophical discussion. That you can try and say it with a certain kind of pseudo insightful passion to it, to go, it is indeed it's just a cold, harsh world in which we live. And people go, phew. And no one takes any notice of the fact that they are not commenting on the nature of life. That is not what they have in mind when they say it, nor when anyone who hears it said agrees with it. They're not saying life is cold and harsh. Everybody knows that because they're going to die. Everyone who knows that they're going to die, anyone to whom it has come to their attention that they will, sooner or later, be dead meat, there's already that background noise, that background awareness that life is harsh and uncaring and cold. That is out of the way. People, you notice how seldom that enters into any serious conversation amongst people. It is now just, it is part of a man's intellectual heartbeat. It is a part of his continuing unspoken memory. So after that one thing, once you realize that you're going to die, and you have to ask your parents for affirmation of the fact several times. For those of you that didn't like the news item or didn't get the other night, that point out that the truth, a request for the truth to be reaffirmed, is in fact a request that it be postponed, which is why the several, if not one, pieces of extremely irrefutable, inescapable bad news available to man, in this case, that he's going to die. Children, I assume it happened to you when you were a child. I assume that none of you were extremely stunted in your intellectual growth. There was some time in your childhood that you stumbled across the possibility that you might die, and you ask a mother or father, some parental figure, if it were true that you might, and if they stumbled around, you go, well, do you mean yes? And they go, well, okay. You went off for some length of time, a few steps, went in another room, a few hours, a few days, something, and you came back and you go, let me get this straight. Me personally, I'm going to die, and just, like Uncle Fred did, or like my hamster did, or like somebody did. And if they finally say yeah, and it might take you 3 times to say, now let me get this straight. No matter what I do, no matter that I eat all my food and I go to bed at night and I get good grades, and I never make you mad again, I'm still going to die. All right, when you finally, let's give you credit and say by the 3rd affirmation, reaffirmation of the fact, of the truth, that you're going to die, you realize it cannot be postponed according to the verbal description. So then the postponement comes that, well, I won't think about it, which is operationally how it works. People do not decide they won't think about it. It's just that life is built, is arranged throughout its structure, including at the micro level in man, in such a way that any sane person, that is part of the definition of sanity, that a sane person does not dwell upon that which will drive them insane. And any sane person, should you go around continually, an ordinary sane person, should you go around continually thinking about the fact you would die, you would shortly cease to be an ordinary sane person. So when I say that the child finally goes, well, after he's finally convinced by at least the 3rd time that, yes, I'm sorry, dear, but you are going to die. But, and you go, well, never mind, I got it. Then it's not when I said that the child decides, well, I just won't think about it. I was, as always, being non-literally magnanimous, that you did not decide. No one decides that they will not, but things are arranged in such a way as for your own self-protection that life arranges it where once you have it reaffirmed sufficiently that there's no doubt that you accept the fact I'm going to die. There's nothing useful to do that information, and so it's like, I forget it. So, now remember, that's there though. But after that fact, that is the big fact. Anything less than that that's the bad news. Anything less than that is kitty bad news. You understand? You have taken the strongest intellectual body blow you're ever going to take at the ordinary level. Is that, yes, Billy, I'm going to have to tell you the truth. That's after you've asked your mother, 3 or 4 times, or I was giving you credit 3. If you come and you keep taking on her dress and you come back 2 or 3 days in a row and go, let me get this straight. And she stops cooking again, wipes the flour, and she says, yes, dear. And you go, you mean you're beautiful little Billy boy, you mean I'm going to die. And she finally says, listen, I hate to tell you that the first time. I was going, you brought it up, but yes, will you leave me alone? Yes, you're going to die. That is the strongest, that is the biggest body blow to the mind that an ordinary person ever experiences. To such a degree, as I point out, it would be, were it in your continual awareness, would be truly detrimental. It would be so destabilizing that you could not grow up and function in an ordinary manner. And so, life is arranged to where you, for all intents and purposes, operationally speaking, you forget it. But you understand the point is you have taken the biggest piece of bad news at that level you'll ever get. So after that, any other bad news is like kitty bad news. It's small-time bad news compared to that, which you don't really think about anymore. Nobody likes to, except at times if your mother then does die later. The very person that had to tell you anyway, and it comes back to you, and that's why people do fall into temporary bouts of reflection and apparent deep thought around funeral homes and at wakes. It's when death comes that close. But as a rule, you do not individually think about it in some personally anecdotal manner. It is not part of your experience, and at the time, generally, but at times that it gets very close into your life of your personal experience, such as a family member dies, the shock, even then you understand, is people try to get over it. People encourage each other, you got to get over it, and you do if you're sane. Back to where this is. You got this big piece of bad news for the mind at that level, that you're going to die. It's there. It is not part by any means of anyone's continuing mental repertoire. You do not think about death as applicable to you. So then we're back to, or into what I was pointing out was kitty bad news. No, there's lesser bad news. Nothing's going to compare with that. So any other bad news after that is of some lesser degree. The lesser degree is what people speak about, that it's a cold, hard, harsh world out there. When they say that, they are not, as I was attempting to point out, they are not reflecting in some wide philosophical manner that, yes, it's a cold, harsh world out there that I'm going to die. They've already known that. But when this kind of thing comes up, when conversations reach a point of personal anecdotes and experiences being passed about, to where someone finally makes a temporary coda to the conversation and goes, well, it's a cold, harsh world sometimes out there. They're not referring to death, and they're not referring to life. Even if they say, well, life, it can be, just cold and harsh. We might as well face it. And everybody goes, well, that's true. They are not thinking about death. They're thinking about something specifically that was non-fatal that happened to them. And they're not speaking of life. They're not speaking of it as some inspecific, something that happened. They're not speaking about that they went outside and it rained on their brand new suit, or that they slipped in the mud and ruined their brand new dress. They're not speaking of some sort of inspecific piece of bad luck that befell them. They are referring specifically, without saying so, they're referring specifically to other humans' treatment of them. When ordinary people say, well, it's a cold, harsh world, they're not referring to some piece of indiscriminate bad luck. If they do, it's an exception. What they're referring to is something that another person has done to them. All right. But that's not even the basis of it. The reason I went through all that, if I didn't make it clear, was to try to get you to see that at first you might think, well, to take the idea that life is cold and harsh and impartial down to a personal level, I want you to see that in one sense, at first blush, you might think, well, that's progress overtaking life, just generally speaking, to be cold and harsh. That to take it down to an individual level is a certain amount of intellectual progress, that you have narrowed your focus down to a more specific area. See, and then I was supposed to trip you up, sort of. Not trip you enough to make you fall, but to make you stagger and get off that kind of mundane, predictable course. Because when men say there's a cold, harsh world out there, and even if you now can see what I'm pointing toward, that they mean it, generally speaking, it would be an exceptional It'd be an exception if it was otherwise. What they are thinking about when they say that, what they're agreeing to when they hear it said, is that other humans treat me. Other humans treat each other, but who the hell cares? I mean, they're doing it to each other, but yeah, they do. But they treat me sometimes in a cold, harsh manner. The basis of it is this. It seems to be they have to, as always, ordinary mind to personalize it and make it appear to be something that's happening amongst humans, that is something that humans are responsible for, that's something humans are consciously, semi-consciously, subconsciously, demi-consciously engaged in, this kind of harsh, cold behavior, treatment of one another, and yet that's not what is being said. What is actually occurring is that one man's intellectual wherewithal is referring to the wherewithal of man instinctively. It is a man's mental world commenting upon his instinctive world. That is, to the mind, where all harshness, coldness, impartiality arises. That is the home. They do not analyze it that way. It comes up in certain condemnations of their fellow man, but again, they don't see that it has any significance to them. But what they're commenting, what they're making note of, is the fact that to the mind, the source, the true source, if pressed, and they could see it no matter how I'm describing it, the only source to them. Again, forgetting death, but that's already a given. But anything this side of death that seems to be harsh, cold, uncaring, is simply a manifestation of man's instinct. It is simply a manifestation of the spark of life. For when I say instinct, I am referring to the basic will to live. To the mind, it is harsh, it is cold, it is uncaring. From the mind's view. But consider the rest of the news story. That this comment is a man's intellectual world commenting on the instinctive one. And the instinctive one being a realm which the mind's observations thereof are, to say the least, self-serving. And that is not a condemnation of the mind, because everything the mind does must be self-serving, or you're not sane. Everything a man's instinct does is self-serving, or you're not sane. You're certainly not healthy, but you're not sane physically. That if you're just an ordinary, reasonable person, you're genetically sound, then everything you do instinctively is self-serving. It would only be a fool that would just eat food to impress others. That if you fell in with some crowd of deranged gourmets, I don't know, that were so hip and sophisticated that they only ate certain foods, and the foods were depriving them of necessary nutrients and vitamins, but only someone not sane physically would partake of instinctive behavior, or would engage in behavior to feed instinctive needs that were not self-serving. So when I referred to the intellect's comments about, its unknowing comments about it being a harsh, cold, uncaring world out there, when what they're commenting on is not the world out there, not other people's behavior, but actually upon the instinctive aspect of human life. That's what they're commenting on, but then it concludes by saying that the mind is making observations of this world, which it scarcely understands, scarcely thinks about, but it's making an observation, or all of its such observations are, to say the very least, self-serving. Now, if I'd left it at that, and you heard it, and it made some sense rhetorically to start with, then by putting that its observations, that is, of the mind, are, to say the least, self-serving, that was the final words of the news story, then you could take it quite reasonably, which I knew when I wrote it that way, as being at least of some sort of criticism of the intellect. To say that, well, its observations are self-serving because, connotatively speaking, the way the term self-serving is normally used is that a comment is made or an action is taken, which the only purpose of the comment or the act is to benefit the actor or the speaker. And to say that under ordinary conditions, even if you said no more, people will connotatively take that comment to mean, well, it is selfish to the degree that is untoward. People don't analyze it, but if you say that something is self-serving, an ordinary civilized mind takes that to be a criticism. And the tacit response to that again, people certainly do not go any further to analyze, is the tacit addition to that, that people should be operating in a manner that is charitable. They should be operating in manners that are not simply self-serving. They should be, in some small way at least, their brother's keeper. That part of their life should be owed to other people. That part of their actions, part of their comments should be for the benefit of other people, not just for themselves. They should not be living in such a way that is totally self-serving. Everyone understands that. That is, at the ordinary city level, that would be perhaps verbally the height, or the highest possible description, and description of a truly civilized, decent person, is that they do not live simply for themselves, that their acts and their words even are not merely self-serving. Because the connotation of that being that the man would be an egomaniac in his speech. He would be absolutely without any feeling, without any charity, without any concern for his fellow man, because we've already said that his acts and perhaps his words are self-serving. And that's taken as a criticism. And yet everyone knows, they can hear it, described quite simply, that if you take away the singular aspect of man, that is his mind, then everything that a man does, unless he is absolutely deranged, unless he is ill, unless he's flawed himself, that instinctively, at the bio survival level, everything he does is properly so self-serving. And you don't expect anything less. You don't expect anything less of those who are apparently in positions of external power, have some control, have some wealth, have some standing, but you also expect the same from those that seem to be in much less position. It is simply not in question. If they were forced to analyze it for a second, no one would question the fact that at the instinctive, that is the physical level, that everything a man does should be self-serving. You've got to do that to stay alive. But then when it rises above the instinctive level into a man's singular intellectual, his mental world, then it is taken as a condemnation to say that what he does is self-serving, that what he thinks is self-serving, and actions that derive from his thinking, not his instincts, but derive now from his thinking, if they're self-serving, they are unworthy. Because only an animal would operate simply on the basis of that which is self-serving. That only a dog will take away food from another dog, and the second dog look at him sad like, well, I haven't eaten since you have. You've eaten, you're in much better shape than I am, let me have some. And the dog that got the food gives no notice to it. That his actions are going to be totally self-serving, and no one will find fault therewith. And by the same token, if they could listen real quick, they would say, well, yeah, that's true with man. For instance, if a billionaire was not self-serving at the physical level enough to keep himself alive, then he couldn't do charitable works. The kind of man who sets up foundations, hands out grants, gives out large sums of his wealth constantly. He can't do it if he gets so weak that he can't think. He gets so that he starves himself into a coma, or he eats poison. He gets deranged. If he gets to change his will and he dies, and his drunken son gets it all. It is simply that even at the human level, at the basic level, ordinary, civilized, intelligent people will agree that yes, everybody must, if we're speaking strictly of physical, instinctive health, the health of a man, they would say, then I'll grant you this, at a very basic level, then he must look after himself. Or to use your terms, what he does at the physical level has got to be minimally self-serving. And they would say, yeah, all right, we got that. But now when you start talking about the things in a man's world that are above, that are beyond the mere efforts to survive physically, then we have a completely different story. But may I say, then we do not have a different story whatsoever. But it seems completely different. And the mind is continually commenting on it's a cold, harsh world, when it is the mind commenting unknowingly on the instinctive world. But it has no choice, if it's healthy at the ordinary level, than to make observations of that nature, that is, to find grave fault with certain aspects of human behavior, with certain aspects of life, as they would call it philosophically, that is, that it can be harsh, cold, uncaring. But the observation they're making, they cannot likewise see, coming from the mind, are self-serving to the mind in the same way that it is needed for the health, the normal stability of the mind. Did that get convoluted enough? To be an ordinary sane person, you got to believe that other people, that humanity, in a weak moment you might give it that much lip service, theoretically, that humans in general are far too selfish, that humans far too, too much of a degree are selfish, and that their thoughts and the actions that derive from the mind, not the body's desire for self-preservation, but from the mind, are too self-serving when they do not realize that the mind must operate on the same sort of basis as the instinct does, as the body does, and if it did not think things that were self-serving. In the same way that the body must eat certain food, must get enough food, must look after itself to even do good deeds. That a priest, a rabbi, has got to feed himself to be able to get up the next day, and he's got to get enough sleep, stay out of the cold, and keep his health to get up the next day and to go out and to help feed the homeless and the sick, to look after them. With that, no one finds fault. But then the mind will not realize that mentally men must live that same sort of apparently cold, harsh, impartial, self-serving life to survive. No one sees any significance, I assume, between all of this and the way that you look at your own thoughts. The way, without any analysis normally, but the way your thoughts, it is the relationship between what seems to be your better consciousness, or what would seem or should seem to be the kind of awareness that this sort of activity would help fuel. And then you look at your thoughts, the kinds of concerns that of what goes through your mind and seems to be your mental life, and you do not normally see it in the same kind of relationship because you find fault with it. You find fault with health at the ordinary degree, at the ordinary level. Which is why, pardon my French, it's why this one guy this night that worked on a lot of things of thinking he was first when he was young, he was all right, and then the more he got to engaging in certain kind of unusual activities and self-study and all, he decided that he wasn't quite all right. But then after years of that, of trying to move through that, he finally came to a liberating kind of medical outlook of his own, which was, fuck health. And then the closing comment, the prescription was, what is the transcendental? What is it at all if it is not that which will take you beyond where you are? Well, yes, sometimes my thoughts are cold and harsh, and sometimes they're charitable. So, you're going to quit, you're going to try to stop singing, right? Like the bird? Maybe you'll get to where you can stop singing sometimes. But can you stop thinking about singing? Is it all on? Okay.